She had no idea the man she just slammed against a squad car was about to be defended by the one judge in this city, that corrupt cops pray they never meet. That's how this story starts, not with a siren, not with a gunshot, but with a phone. Darnell Washington was standing outside a convenience store on a Tuesday afternoon, doing absolutely nothing. He was scrolling through a spreadsheet on his phone. Because Darnell was an accountant, the kind of guy who color codes his tax folders in June, he was waiting for his sister to finish grabbing a bag of chips inside. That was the entire crime scene. Phone, a parking lot, a little sunlight. Darnell Washington was 29 years old. He had a spotless record. No arrests, no citations, not even a parking ticket he could remember. He paid his bills on time. He volunteered at his church's financial literacy program on weekends, and he had just gotten a promotion at the firm where he worked. If you asked anyone who knew him to describe him in one word, they'd probably say steady. Darnell didn't do drama. He didn't look for trouble. He was a man who believed deeply and simply that if you did things the right way would eventually do right by you. He was about to learn that belief comes with a price tag, and someone else was going to be the one who paid it back. Officer Savannah Mitchell pulled up in her patrol car 9 minutes into her shift change, responding to a call about suspicious activity near the store. A vague, thin, practically meaningless report that could have described half the people standing on any sidewalk in America. She was a rookie 4 months out of the academy, still carrying the stiff posture of someone who'd memorized the manual, but hadn't yet learned the difference between authority and respect. She believed with the kind of certainty that only comes from inexperience, that the badge on her chest was the final word in every conversation she'd ever have again. She approached Darnell with her hand resting near her, belt her voice already sharp before she'd said a single word that required sharpness. "Sir, I need you to step away from the store and tell me what you're doing here." Darnell looked up from his phone, calm, unhurried. "Just waiting on my sister, officer. She's inside." It was a simple answer, a true one, but Mitchell's eyes narrowed like she'd caught him in a lie he hadn't told. "You're being awfully calm for someone who was just described as acting suspicious." Darnell almost laughed, not out of disrespect, but out of genuine confusion at the logic of the sentence. How was calm supposed to look? He kept his hands visible, he kept his voice. Even he kept doing every single thing he had been taught his whole life to do in exactly this moment. "I'm not sure what to tell you. I've just been standing here too." Mitchell, that composure didn't read as innocence. It read as defiance, and in her 4 months on patrol she had already built a private, dangerous little theory that defiance was the first sign of guilt. And guilt needed to be met with force before it could escalate. She didn't realize the escalation was coming from her own hands. "Turn around, hands behind your back, officer." "I haven't done anything, Can." "You tell me why." "Turn around now." Darnell complied. Slowly, carefully, the way a man complies when he has replayed this exact nightmare in his head 100 times before it ever happened to him, because he grew up hearing about men who complied, and it wasn't enough. He turned, he put his hands behind his back, and that was the moment Mitchell would later swear under the weight of her own badge that he made. A threatening movement, a shift of his shoulder, a step that could have been an attempt to flee or strike. It hadn't been, bystanders would say. It hadn't been. A convenience store camera, angled just enough to catch the corner of the lot, would say it hadn't been. But Mitchell said it, and she said it fast, and she said it with the practiced ease of someone reading from a script she'd rehearsed long before she ever needed it. She slammed him against the hood of her cruiser. A small crowd gathered, phones rising like a wave of silent witnesses. Darnell's sister came out of the store to see her brother pinned, down, his cheek pressed to hot metal, his voice steady even as his body wasn't. "I'm not resisting. I'm not resisting. Please, I'm not resisting." He wasn't. Everyone could see he wasn't everyone, it seemed, except the one person whose report would decide what happened to him next. Back at the precinct, Officer Mitchell sat down to write her report with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before, or who had been taught how to do this before. Though nobody watching her fingers move across the keyboard could have told the difference between practice and instinct. The report was clean too. Clean. Every sentence landed exactly where it needed to, building a narrative brick by brick: suspicious behavior, non-compliance, a threatening gesture, a justified use of force. It read less like an account of events and more like a legal argument, preloaded with every phrase a prosecutor would need, and every phrase a defense attorney would struggle to unravel. It moved up the chain as these things do, headed for a bail hearing. That was supposed to be routine, a formality, 5 minutes, a signature. And Darnell Washington would spend the night in a cell before the machinery ground forward, toward a plea deal he didn't deserve, Except the file landed on the desk of Judge Marcus Carter. They called him the Scale, not because he was harsh, and not because he was soft, but because he was exact, precise, unmovable. He had earned the name over 15 years on the bench, but he had earned the instinct behind it, decades earlier in a cell that wasn't his own crime that put him there. Long before he wore the robe Marcus Carter had worn a number wrongfully convicted at 22, based on a coerced confession and a police report that in hindsight read exactly like the one now sitting in front of him, too neat, too practiced, too confident in details that should have been messy if they were true. He spent 6 years appealing studying law from a prison library, learning the exact anatomy of how a fabricated story gets built to survive scrutiny. When his name was finally cleared by DNA evidence, he didn't ask for a payout and a quiet life. He asked for a law degree, then a judgeship, then he spent the rest of his career doing one thing, making sure no other innocent man's future got decided by someone else's convenient fiction. He read Mitchell's report twice, then a third time. Something in the rhythm of it bothered him. Real reports, honest ones, had friction, hesitations, redundant details, the natural mess of someone recalling a chaotic moment. This report had none of that. It moved in a straight line, hitting every legal threshold like a checklist, using phrases that sounded less like an officer's memory and more like a template built by someone who understood exactly what words made an arrest. Bulletproof in court, Judge Carter set the file down and looked at his clerk pull every camera within a block of that, store traffic cams, business cams, anything, and get me Officer Mitchell's training. File, I want to know exactly who taught her how to write a report like this. His clerk hesitated. Your Honor, it's a bail hearing. This is usually a formality. Not today, Carter said quietly. Today it's a question, and I intend to get an answer before anyone signs anything. Word moved fast through the precinct, the way it always does when a judge starts asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. Officer Mitchell heard through a colleague that the judge was pulling footage on her arrest. She laughed it off in front of her training officer. It's an open and shut case, she said. The guy resisted. I did my job, but something in her voice cracked slightly on the word job, like she was reciting it more for herself than for the room. Somewhere beneath the confidence she'd built in 4 months of feeling untouchable, a smaller voice was starting to ask a question. She didn't want to answer what exactly had she been trained to do and who had trained her to do it, because Savannah Mitchell hadn't invented the language in that report on her own. Every phrase, every legal trigger word, every carefully placed justification had been handed to her, polished, practiced, and repeated in a training session she'd attended just 3 weeks after graduating the academy, a session that wasn't on any official calendar. A session that didn't exist as far as the department's records were concerned. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't the villain of this story. She was its first domino, and Judge Marcus Carter, the man who had spent 6 years in a cell, built from a report just like hers, was about to knock her over to see exactly how far the line of dominoes went. What none of them knew yet, not Mitchell, not Carter, not even Darnell sitting in a holding cell running numbers in his head just to keep his mind steady, was that someone else had already caught wind of the judge's request for footage, and that someone had a phone in their hand and a decision to make before the sun came up under oath, with the whole courtroom holding its breath. Officer Mitchell finally said the sentence that would end her career and begin an investigation that would end hundreds more. The hearing that was supposed to take 5 minutes now had a data docket number and a growing pile of subpoenaed evidence that nobody in the precinct had expected to see the light of day. Darnell's family had hired Marcus Williams, a defense attorney with a reputation for being quiet in every room until the exact moment he wasn't. Williams didn't do theatrics, he didn't need to. He built his cases the way Judge Carter read reports, brick by brick, patient, exact, until the wall of truth was too tall for anyone to argue their way around. He requested every angle of footage available: the convenience store's exterior camera, a bank, camera across the street, 2 bystander phones, and the piece that would matter most, Officer Mitchell's own body camera, which the initial report had conveniently described as malfunctioning during the critical 10 seconds of the arrest. But 3 days before the hearing, something happened that almost buried the entire case before it began. The store's exterior footage, the one piece of evidence everyone assumed would settle, the matter came back from the department's evidence unit corrupted, unreadable. A technician swore it was a hard drive failure, nothing more. Marcus Williams didn't believe in coincidences that convenient, and neither did Judge Carter. Carter ordered a second forensic pass, this time by an independent lab outside the department's own system, and that was when investigators found what the first review had missed, or had been told to miss. The file hadn't failed on its own. It had been overwritten twice in the 48 hours after the judge requested it. Someone inside the evidence unit had tried to make the truth disappear before it ever reached the courtroom. For a moment it looked like the case might collapse entirely. No usable exterior footage, no clean chain of custody and a defense attorney, with nothing left but a body camera. The department still insisted, had simply malfunctioned. Darnell's sister sat outside the courthouse, those 3 days certain her brother's one shot at justice was slipping through a hole someone else had deliberately cut. Then the bystander who had filmed the incident on his own phone came forward again, this time with something nobody expected. He had never uploaded the original file to any cloud service, worried it might get pulled down or lost. He had kept the original memory card untouched in a drawer for weeks, a backup nobody at the department knew existed. It was enough Judge Carter ruled the phone footage admissible and ordered a full criminal referral for whoever had tampered with the store's original recording. The case was back on. The hearing room was packed the day the footage finally played. Darnell sat beside his attorney, in the same steady posture he'd carried his entire life, the posture that had been mistaken for defiance and was now finally about to be understood by the only audience whose understanding could actually change something. Marcus Williams stood calm as ever and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'd like to play the footage from the bystander's phone, time-stamped to the minute of the arrest." Judge Carter nodded. "Proceed." The video rolled Darnell standing with his phone. Mitchell approaching, hand near her belt before a single word was exchanged. Darnell turning slowly, hands visible, compliant in every frame. No threatening movement, no shift of aggression. Just a man doing exactly what he'd been told to do, exactly as he was doing it. Then the audio caught Darnell's voice steady, even as his body was pressed to the hood of the cruiser. I'm not resisting. The courtroom was silent except for that voice playing on a loop of injustice that everyone in the room could now see plainly for what it was. Judge Carter's expression didn't change. It rarely did, but there was a specific stillness to him now. A stillness that people who had appeared before him long enough had learned to recognize as the calm before he asked the one question that mattered. He turned to Officer Mitchell, who sat rigid in the witness chair, her academy composure fraying at the edges. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Carter said, his voice even almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd raised it. "Your report describes a threatening movement at the moment you turned him around. I've now watched this footage 6 times. I don't see a threatening movement. I see a man turning around as you instructed him to. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Mitchell's hands were flat against her knees, pressing down like she could hold herself together through sheer physical force. My perception in the moment was that. "I'm not asking about your perception," Carter said. "I'm asking about your report. Your report doesn't describe a perception. It describes a specific verifiable action in specific language that this footage does not support. So I'll ask you again, can you explain the discrepancy?" The silence stretched. Marcus Williams didn't move. Darnell didn't move. The whole room seemed to lean forward by a single collective inch. And then Mitchell broke. "I wrote what I thought would justify the arrest." The sentence landed like a verdict of its own. A gasp moved through the gallery. Darnell closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in something closer to relief so heavy it nearly looked like grief. Judge Carter didn't smile. He never smiled at moments like this, moments where the system finally barely did the thing it was supposed to do all along. To him, this wasn't a victory. It was the bare minimum, arriving 4 months and 1 arrest too late. "Say that again, Officer Mitchell," he said, quietly for the record. Her voice was smaller this time, but it carried anyway. "I wrote what I thought would justify the arrest, not what happened. What I thought would hold up." The hearing didn't end there. It couldn't. Because the phrase "what would hold up" wasn't just an admission of one lie. It was an admission that Mitchell had been operating with a specific understanding, a set of criteria, a formula, a language for exactly what kind of story would survive scrutiny in a courtroom. And nobody invents that kind of formula alone in 4 months on the job. Judge Carr leaned forward. "Officer Mitchell, who taught you to write reports this way?" Her attorney present for the hearing tried to object, tried to shape the answer, tried to draw a line around the damage. But Mitchell, whether from exhaustion or the particular kind of clarity that comes after telling the truth once and realizing the sky didn't fall, kept talking. "There was a training session," she said, 3 weeks after the academy. "Off the books. They called it report optimization. They gave us phrases, trigger language, things that would hold up if a case got questioned. They said every officer needed it, that it was standard, that everyone did it." "Who is they?" Carter asked. Mitchell hesitated, glancing toward the back of the courtroom, where her captain sat, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Captain Drake set it up, but the material, the actual training program, it came from outside the department, a private company, Blue Line Security Solutions." The name meant nothing to most of the room. It would mean everything within the week. and it was Captain Drake. Sitting there watching his own name land in open court, who investigators would later learn had also quietly ordered the overwrite of the store's original footage 3 days earlier, fact nobody in the room knew yet, but one that would turn him from a witness into a defendant before the month was out. Judge Carter sat back, and for the first time in the hearing, something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The particular recognition of a man who had spent 6 years studying exactly how a false narrative gets built to survive appeal after appeal, and who was now looking at the architecture of that same process alive and functioning inside his own city's police department. "This hearing is adjourned," he said. "Mr. Washington's charges are dismissed effective." Immediately, with the court's formal apology for what he was made to endure, he looked toward the prosecutor's table. "And I am referring this matter, the training program, the falsified report, tampering with body camera evidence, and the destruction of the original store footage to federal authorities for full investigation. This does not end with one officer's testimony, it begins there." Darnell exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. His sister, sitting behind him, gripped his shoulder. Marcus Williams allowed himself the smallest, quietest smile, not of victory, but of a debt finally being paid, even partially, even late. Officer Mitchell sat alone in the witness chair, the badge on her chest, suddenly feeling less like armor and more like the weight it had always actually been. "Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're finding this story worth your time, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes next." Because what happened after that hearing didn't stay contained to one courtroom, one officer, or one city block. It was about to become one of the largest law enforcement corruption investigations the state had ever seen, and it started with a rookie's shaking voice admitting a single true sentence. By the time federal agents finished pulling the thread, Judge Carter had started over 500 officers across 3 states were implicated, and the man who almost went to prison for checking his phone became the reason an entire system finally cracked open. The FBI didn't waste time. Judge Carter's referral, paired with the forensic evidence of the tampered body camera, the destroyed store footage, and Mitchell's sworn testimony, gave federal investigators exactly the foothold they needed to move beyond a single precinct. What they found didn't just confirm Mitchell's account, it dwarfed it. Blue Line Security Solutions wasn't a rogue consultant or a single bad actor. It was a privately run, quietly lucrative company that had spent years selling what it called report optimization software and field justification training to police departments across 3 states, always framed as a defensive legal tool, always marketed to precincts nervous about lawsuits and body camera scrutiny. In practice, it was something else entirely, a system engineered to teach officers exactly which phrases, which sequences of events, and which selectively edited footage would hold up against a defense attorney's cross-examination, regardless of what had actually happened on the street. Investigators recovered internal training modules that laid out, almost like a sales pitch, the specific language patterns that had appeared nearly verbatim in Mitchell's report. Threatening movement, non-compliant posture justified, escalation. The phrases weren't Mitchell's instincts, they were product features. The software went further still, a body camera manipulation tool that could introduce brief, difficult-to-detect gaps in footage marketed internally as a way to protect officer discretion during ambiguous encounters. It had been sold quietly to departments that wanted the appearance of transparency without the substance of it. Captain Robert Drake, who had arranged Mitchell's off-book training session, and who had quietly ordered the destruction of the original store footage, was the first domino to fall after her facing his own set of charges, now heavier than anyone expected. He made the calculation that cooperation was the only road left that didn't end in total ruin. He handed federal agents internal emails, invoices, and a client list that read like a map of the conspiracy's reach, dozens of precincts. Hundreds of officers trained a hierarchy of executives at Blue Line who had built an entire business model on teaching law enforcement how to make injustice look procedurally clean. Mitchell cooperated too fully in the weeks that followed. It didn't undo what she'd done to Darnell Washington. It couldn't, but it meant the thread investigators pulled kept unraveling instead of snapping. By the time the federal case was fully built, more than 500 officers across 3 states had been connected in varying degrees to the training program, some who had merely attended a session and never used it, others who had built entire careers of clean-looking arrests on a foundation of coach language and quietly edited footage. It was, prosecutors said publicly, one of the most significant law enforcement evidence tampering conspiracies uncovered in the state's history. The trials that followed took the better part of a year. Officer Savannah Mitchell, having cooperated fully and pled guilty to charges of tampering with evidence and conspiracy to obstruct justice, stood before a different judge for sentencing, not Judge Carter, who had recused himself from any proceeding connected to her case the moment it became clear he might be seen as anything other than fully impartial. She was sentenced to 5 years, with 3 years suspended pending her continued cooperation with ongoing federal proceedings against Blue Line Security Solutions and its executives. It was not leniency in the way some read it, it was the system's imperfect way of acknowledging the difference between the architect of a lie and the person handed a script and told it was standard procedure, while still holding her accountable for the choice she made to use it against a man who had done nothing. Captain Drake received a considerably longer sentence once the destruction of evidence charge was added to his file, a fact that surprised no one who had watched him sit silent in that courtroom, while his own name was spoken aloud for the first time. The executives of Blue Line Security Solutions did not receive that same consideration. Tried separately, they were found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and wire fraud, tied to the contracts they'd sold under false pretenses to police departments across state lines. The company's remaining leadership faced sentences considerably longer than Mitchell's, a fact that federal prosecutors made a point of noting publicly. The people who built the machine bore more weight than the newest hands who'd only just learned to operate it. The precinct itself did not escape consequence. A joint civil suit brought by Darnell Washington and a growing number of other individuals, who came forward once the investigation went public, resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement money that, while it could never fully repair what had been taken, at least represented a formal, undeniable acknowledgement this had happened. It had been wrong, and it would cost something real. Judge Marcus Carter did not attend the sentencing hearings. It wasn't his place anymore, and he'd learned long ago not to confuse justice with spectacle. Instead, he spent those months doing what he'd done since the day he put on the robe reading files, asking the second question when the first answer sounded too smooth, refusing to let a clean report be mistaken for a true one. He did, however, attend one hearing months later, not as a judge but as a private citizen, invited to City Council to speak on a new independent oversight measure being implemented in the wake of the scandal. Every arrest report involving use of force would now be reviewed by a civilian board with subpoena power of its own. Every officer, regardless of tenure, would undergo mandatory annual bias and de-escalation training, taught by outside experts unaffiliated with any private vendor. Body cameras were fitted with tamper-evident recording systems that made the kind of manual manipulation used against Darnell technically impossible, and evidence storage itself was moved to an independent third-party system no single precinct could quietly access alone. Carter kept his remarks short. He wasn't a man who needed the microphone longer than the point required. A badge is not a right, he told the council chamber, his voice as even as it had been the day he asked Officer Mitchell to explain her report. It's a responsibility. The moment we forget the difference, we stop protecting people and start protecting power instead. Sunlight remains the best disinfectant we have. All I did was open a window. Darnell Washington went back to his life in the quiet, undramatic way that people who never wanted to be a story in the first place tend to do. He returned to the accounting firm where his colleagues had followed the case with a kind of stunned, quiet solidarity. He kept volunteering at his church's financial literacy program. On weekends, he kept his record spotless, not that it had ever truly needed cleaning, only that the world had needed to catch up to what was true about him all along. He didn't do interviews for the sake of doing them, but he did agree to speak once briefly at the City Council hearing where the new oversight measures were adopted, standing a few feet from the same judge who had refused to let a clean report end his story on someone else's terms. I didn't do anything, Darnell said simply. That day or any day before it, I just want to make sure the next person who didn't do anything doesn't have to prove it the way I did. It was not a speech built for headlines, it didn't need to be. It was true, and it was enough. Officer Mitchell, for her part, would go on to serve her sentence, and whatever came after it remained her own long road to walk, one shaped by the sentence she'd been willing eventually to say out loud in front of a packed courtroom. I wrote what I thought would justify the arrest. It was the truth that broke her career. It was also the truth that broke something much larger than her career, and in the end that mattered more. The city changed slowly, the way cities do, not through one dramatic gesture, but through oversight boards and training requirements and tamper-proof cameras and 100 small procedural corrections that would never make headlines on their own, but that existed now because one man checked his phone outside a convenience store and one judge refused to sign a report just